Our next presentation is on the use of quasi-random numbers for individualized student assessment. Would be presented by Garrick Small. Please take it away. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Johan. We're going to be actually doing this as a bit of a tag team. So my colleagues Lan Sun and Stephen Boyd are going to be joining me with this presentation. So I certainly can't take all of the credit or perhaps all of the rotten tomatoes. This activity or this perspective kind of grew out of some needs, mainly the need to give students individualised data sets, but outside the limitations of what's possible through Moodle quizzes. And so it's kind of grown up over a period of time. So we've used it successfully now in a number of units. And basically what we're doing is using what's called quasi-random numbers. Quasi-random numbers are things that look like random numbers, but in fact are generated as a result of some knowable source, what we call a seed. And to illustrate the way that works, and to a certain extent the simplicity of it, to show you how to define quasi-random numbers in Microsoft Excel, if you take the trigonometrical sign of the number 2 and you look at all the decimal places that normally hide in Excel, you find that when you change the seed number, the 2, to something only a little tiny bit different, the first part of the number remains more or less the same, which you can see in that slide, but the tail end of the number changes very rapidly. So if you take the last half dozen digits, so in this case 682, and then compare that to the last 6 digits of only changing the seed by a very tiny amount, those last 6 digits look like they're just random numbers. They just come from all over the shop. If you use those last 6 digits, which is fairly easy to isolate in Excel, and the Excel speak is there on the slide, you end up with what I'd call a proportioning factor, that P number. And if we
You went mute.
I've gone mute, sorry about that. That's a dreadful thing. If we then set upper and lower limits to the random numbers that we're really interested in, because we're not always going to be wanting numbers between 0 and 1, which is what those last half dozen digits do. Just hang on for a moment. Great. What you are able to do is fairly easily generate these apparently random numbers kind of in the areas that you want. If you want a decimal number or like a number between 1 and 100, such as there, you can simply set the upper and lower limits, and with a fairly simple equation and that proportioning factor, you can end up generating your quasi-random number. And if the seed wasn't 2 but 2.00000001, the number looks entirely different, even though it's extremely close. Okay, from that, we aren't limited to creating simply one random number. You can produce an entire set of them by making your seed a little bit more interesting. In the subjects that we've set these up for, typically there might be, well, anywhere from half a dozen to 20 or 30 values that the students will be given as a data set. And so each one of those will have an item number. We change the way it works year to year in case we have a student returning, so they end up with a new set of data, so we put the year in. And we simply add those together, and then we get the students to put in their student number, usually with a bit of password protection so students can't mess up all the cleverness that's hiding in the background. And you end up with a slightly more complicated seed. And from that, you can end up with a whole series of apparently random numbers. Now, the advantage is that you can give the student a data set. All they have to do is enter their student number. They can be online, they can be anywhere they like, really suits the COVID environment. And then they can go off and work with that data set to do their assignment. It really suits assignments that require fairly complicated sets of data. We find that in finance and financial modelling, discounted cash flow modelling, in property evaluation, in accounting, and especially in disciplines like engineering. And being able to have that flexibility for the students to do that themselves is very handy. The other side of it, though, which is handy for the academics, is that you use your class list to generate a set of individualised solutions. And so marking is really easy. And the nice thing is, if you want to persist, you can even automate that, so you can mark all of the class's work pretty much with a handful of button presses and so on. What we'll do now, I'll move to Lan Sun, will show us applications of it in finance.
Thanks, Garrick. The use of quasi-random data to generalize individualized student assignment has been applied in teaching statistics, mathematics, and accounting. So we are thinking if we can apply this method in finance and the property courses, which is also heavily quantitative. So what we did experiment, we did for Think 20018, Managerial Finance. This is a postgraduate level finance unit. And in this unit, we have 3 assessment components. One is written assessment, weight 20%, practical assessment, weight 30%, and a final exam, weight 50%. The first piece, written assessment, is the one we apply this method, quasi-random data, to create individualized student assignment. We compare the student mark result before and after application. Before application in Term 1 2019, when we use traditional assignment method where the student, they have all the same data and they produce the standard answer, we can see that more students receive 15 out of 20 distinction, which is not bad. And after application in Term 3 2019, we can see there's a clear shift. There are more students receive 17 out of 20, high distinction. This is even better. And we also see there's a clear reduction in plagiarism case. Yeah, go ahead here. No, before, no. Stephen, the 6th number. Yeah, thank you. Before application in Term 1 2019, we had 6 plagiarism case, and after application, it reduced to 0. Stephen? Yeah, so this is something that we are very pleased to see in the reduction of the plagiarism case. Of course, there are some other benefits as well. For example, students are more engaged because it's a relatively new method. So they need to know how to retrieve the data. They have more questions towards you. So they're genuinely engaged with you, which is good. It also helps the student to improve problem solving skill because they need to know how to use the Excel template, Excel function. So this also gives the sense of authenticity to the assessment piece. And it is definitely quicker to mark, save the marking time, so improve marking efficiency. But there's still some concern we need to take into account as well. For example, if the student use wrong data, they will get wrong answer. Everything will fall into piece. So there's a lot of coaching to help the student to understand how it works. Also, it may not suitable for repeating student. For example, if the student, they fail in one term and they repeat in the second term. So because there's the same student ID, so literally they're having the same data set, they are doing actually the same assessment. So maybe they will find the limited value for the repeating student. And although there is a reduction in the plagiarism case, but some students may still try to plagiarize the working process, means they collaborate, they work together. So these are the issues that we need to consider in the future application. Now I will pass on to Stephen. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Lan, and thank you, Garrick. I had the pleasure as well this term to work with that finance unit and to see this interaction with a larger cohort. And it was really encouraging to see that most students understood how the system worked after a bit of instruction. I found that there was a little bit of a hiccup, just basically about 5 students or 5 out of 87 submissions, or about 5.7% of those students did have a trouble with incorrectly entering a code or getting the wrong data set. So as Lyle was saying, I guess some streamlining up the front end might assist them through that process, or alternatively, it might even be an indicator that that student might be, I guess, trying to find an easier way through this assessment task. But over onto experiences in property. We have applied the same process to our property studies as well. In particular, there's one unit which is, I think, 19014, or basically property investment and finance, where this has been applied to one of these students' assignments. It does align very well with the learning outcomes, which are very much around that applied application in financial analysis. The 4 learning outcomes out of this unit were related to analysing processes involved in property investment, evaluating alternative property investment strategies, applying discounted cash flow analysis techniques to property investments, and incorporating risk analysis into practical investment studies. Why this is important is that this is quite authentic, the idea that a property valuer or somebody who analyses cash flows has an initial perception early on of where those numbers might sit, and as they get more information and they get to confirm their assumptions, they are progressively changing the calculations as they work through. So by somebody undertaking an assignment or assessment similar to this one, there is a level of authenticity attached to the processes that they follow through. So there were 2 assessment pieces in this particular property unit. The first one related to selecting a property in their local area and preparing a financial analysis and report. That was the particular assessment that had this component of actually incorporating and actually overriding their numbers that they initially put together with numbers that they picked up through the test data sheet generator. So in that way, they provide their model and then they go along and use their particular numbers that they're allocated to input those into the model to test on its precision. So that's how this is incorporated into that first assessment task. So I guess without holding you up too long, there are a couple of emerging findings that have come through this exercise, that we do have, I guess, an ability to go along and give students individualized numbers, which has clear benefits with respect to students copying answers. It doesn't overcome the fact that we might still have students effectively copying models or spreadsheets, but it does mean that the answers themselves are very hard to go along and replicate. So we have got a certain benefit attached in that plagiarism side of things. We will, as we find new interfaces, find a way to streamline this process so that it gets a little bit easier for that student, so that they just input their numbers and basically they get a nice free-flowing instruction sheet that's individualized for themselves. And that's probably a next stage of this development. But there was one other thing that I'd like to share as well, and that relates to future applications and even outside of higher education. A lot of, I guess, institutes, whether it's relating to accounting, whether it's related to property or other, have considered that they need to play more of a role in assisting students from university into the industry and providing them with sort of bridging programs. The Australian Property Institute is one who has, I guess, allocated time to developing resources in this space. But like a lot of professional organisations, they do kind of leave the assessment to be a tag on at the end. And often their assessments are related to quizzes or otherwise materials that can be very easily copied from student to student. By different groups like this taking a more active involvement, whether it's making students develop models and actually run through specific scenarios, there can be a level of authenticity that might be replicated, as well as an efficiency gain as well. So it is an interesting space to look into. But that sort of brings my part of this presentation to a close, and I'll hand over to Garrick.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And I think what we've done is sort of shown you the effectiveness, the theory, and some applications. And so now we'd welcome questions. Anyone who may be thinking about how does this work for other teaching?
Any questions or interests of using such approaches?
I just thought it was really interesting that there was a reduction, sorry, an improved grade and a reduction in plagiarism when the students had individualised tasks. I'm intrigued. I wonder what the psychology is behind that, you know, like the students have somehow more interest or personal buy-in or into the assessment. It's a really interesting approach.
Yeah, Rachel, I think you make a good point with that, the interest or perhaps even the engagement, because when there's one size fits all for the entire class, especially when you have a large online cohort within your class, it's very difficult to get that individualised situation for students, and even in classroom situations, probably even worse. It's very easy to email the solutions around, and really the markers don't know anything about it. So I suspect these students take it a lot more seriously, and as a result, we can't get the plagiarism. I guess we're trying to stay one step ahead. We've mentioned a couple of times the possibility of model sharing. The example that Stephen has up, I think, is a good illustration of the kind of complexity of student work that can be bolted onto a relatively small data set. On the slide there, a little bit hard to read, but the blue numbers and the violet numbers are the data set. The rest of the page is written by the students. This is the sort of thing that the students will be expected to do and understand in professional practice. And for us, it's almost impossible to mark one of these things if they do it totally authentically, pluck numbers from the market. Whereas by being able to give them these data sets and not in the confines of a Moodle quiz, students are then able to go off and build something like this. They've got the obligation to get it right. They know that we're going to be checking it very thoroughly. And especially if we're reminding them that this is what you're going to be doing in industry, and you're going to be accountable for absolutely getting it right, because your clients will take you to court if you get it wrong. That kind of obligation, I think, does get a lot of buy-in. And the students see it as really lively and important. They can't deliver, fancy words, but baloney. This has got to be very precise. And as I say, we've tried it now in 3 subject areas, and it seems to be working, very well. The students seem to like it.
Thank you very much. Very interesting concept. Actually, authentic assessment design, personalized assessment design is a topic that we all academics consider. We may not be able to always do, but when we are working with numbers, especially, it's easier to copy solutions. So it is even more important. Thank you so much.